Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Khalid, and also thank you for the scientific committee for inviting me to be here and to represent a perspective from regulatory perspective. And I think this is really healthy interactions between the regulators and the practitioners, and also the industrial. So the main scope of this presentation is about the regulatory approval for clinical trials in general and the gene and cell and gene therapies. Yeah. So the scope of the presentation, as I said, it's about ATMBs. Maybe I can use this one just. Thank you. Okay, great. So the scope is about ATMBs, and ATMBs is regulatory terminology. So, and more focus in this presentation about the cellular therapy. Also, I would like to address the concept of point of care manufacturing and the quality system related to this, because it's also with the CAR T cells. If we look to recent trends, that there is decentralized procedures, which is they produce it in the hospitals, the CAR T cells, and also the centralized procedures where they have to produce the CAR T cells or the manufacturing of the CAR T cells outside in one centralized place. Also, I'm going to share some of our experience from regulatory considerations. Also, some learning lessons from our perspective, and to go over the roadmap for the guidelines that to help the practitioners and the people involved in this project to find the right guidelines. Not sure how to use this. This is automatic. Okay, why it's important from regulatory perspective? There's too many factors actually why we think it's really important, and I'm not going to elaborate more about the medical needs for ATMBs in general and what can they provide for the patient. I think this has already been addressed, but also there is another perspective related to the ATMBs, that the limitations in the manufacturing perspective. So that means, for example, the accessibility to the local patient will be a lot less. So that's why we need, from regulatory perspective, to give special attentions to these pathways, so they can have more accessible to the patient. And just to give you an example, with the CAR T cells, it's autologous and it's a personalized medicine. So you can imagine that there is a very few type of product will be produced per year. Another thing is that we expect a huge number of clinical trials, and this is from the studies that we know, and also in the development and the pipelines of worldwide. In this slide, actually, what I want to present here, that there is two perspectives. In the clinical trials, there's a huge emphasis from the academia, or we can also elaborate about the hospital settings that really comparable to the industrial in terms of the productions and development of CAR T cells. And if we look to the just the recent years, they have matching between the local from research perspective and also from industrial. So that's a sign for us as regulators that when it comes from research settings to directly to regulations, that comes with a lot of gaps in terms of understanding the regulations related to the industrial. Although the industrial usually they have more aware of the CAR T cells. And so that emphasizes our role to be more transparent and to introduce what CAR T cells is about. And also wanted also to hear and to show some of the products that we already have and be experienced with. We have quantum CAR T cells approved, which is Kymriah, and also another gene therapy approved. We have a product that's been under review right now, multiple myelomas and SMA. They are under review right now and for registrations. For clinical trials, we have products that already been approved for hemophilia A, and also this is from the gene therapy perspective, and for the CAR T cells perspective, we have the product that's been under review and in the final stage, I believe, for the CAR T cells for the ALA. Again, from regulatory perspective, usually we have to emphasize more about the classification of the product. We are talking about the long-term commitment and the long-term of this type of product that we are going to produce. Part of it is the classifications. And just want to emphasize that the classification could be really important. We have published guidelines for the classifications, and just to emphasize that these type of products evolve in every day. So it's really good to visit the classification pathways if it's not clear, or you can consult for the SAD FDA. And as we know, we have some of the products, like for example, with the combination products, when they use the medical device, for example, with the biological. So the ATMBs in general, they could be part of a huge variety of technologies, actually. And the case that I'm trying to represent here is more with the cellular therapy. Point of care manufacturing, it's a concept. It's not really new, it's not really old, but with the CAR T cells for sure, only maybe 5-6 years. And recently, I think with the successful story from Barcelona hospitals, they produce with the CAR T cells with hospital exemption pathways, which is a license specifically for the product. We just want to emphasize that if you want to produce it to increase the clinical trials in the country with point care of manufacturing, there's some perspective that you need really to look to it. For example, the facilities and how to deal with the viral vectors. The vectors in general, if it now we are dealing with usually with the CAR T cells with the lentivirus, there's a perspective for that. And also could be also for non-viral vectors, that could be also perspective, and you deal with it as a product. And I will elaborate on this part actually because it's really sensitive. The analytical procedure for testing for this product is crucial, and it's a common business with industrial. But when we have point of care manufacturing, which is based on the hospital settings, usually this gets less tensions, which is really crucial to the product. Of course, operations and, for example, the semi-closed systems, quality systems in terms of the documentations, in terms of the trainings, to comply with the GMP, and there's a lot of perspective in this, and regulatory affair. So point of care manufacturing actually comes with a lot of regulatory perspective that we need to work together in this sense. And then with the viral vectors or the technology that's being used in the CAR T cells, what I want to introduce here that there's too many technologies that been in the research right now, and some of them is really they show some promising results. And for example, but the main concept from regulatory perspective here, that some of these technologies is very well established and mature, and some they are less mature. So when you consider this as a technology in your product, that means if it's less mature, that means you need to have to support it with some supportive studies to ensure that this technology is, the effect of this technology is very clear. And usually with the CAR T cells the lentiviral is the product, but there's also other options of viral vectors that could be produced in future. when you deal with a viral vector, and this is part of the, as I stated, there's a facility and there's a vector, the product is considered to be as a product itself. The applicant, which is the point care applications, if they produce it internally or they outsource it, they need to take care of these type of parameters, which is the safety, for example, the sterility, the detoxings. They need to check it because this is the result there will affect the result of the clinical trials in terms of identity, purity, dosage, potency, and it's a list of requirements. You can find it also in the guidelines of the CAR T cells. But just want to emphasize that the quality of the viral vector, it will be reflected to the procedures that you have. So as much as you can look to these quality to be consistent and high and released based on the high quality, it will be reflected to the patient itself. And also paying attention to this is the crucials because when we move from clinical trials to commercial, all these data will be reviewed, so that you need to be consistent all the time. And here, when we look to the operation model and using the semi-closed systems, I'm just giving examples of the two commercial products, Clinimax and also Concon from platforms, and they show really promising to may have more accessible to the clinical trials. And from our perspective, as we know, this is really what the machine can done inside the productions. For example, after you get the cell collections, you do the separation and selection activations. From our perspective, these operation units, and plus each one of these has a critical process parameters. So whatever we look to these operations inside the machines to be reproducible and to be efficient with a certain degree of quality, because the production of the CAR T cells is based on process. How you produce, so the process will create the product. So that's why we try to emphasize this and to validate these type of machines as a closed system. And just want to emphasize there is a lot of product actually in the market for a closed system. For example, the big giants for Almighty, they also joined this race to produce a system, the closed system, and will help with personalized medicines. Yeah. And from our regulatory perspective and from our experience, I just want to highlight some of these perspectives. One of them is, and the most important part, and we pay attention to the CAR T cells, that the source of the material, it's variant between patient to patient. So that's really hard to, from regulatory perspective, to prove the consistency. So this is really need to be designed from the beginning. So this factor is against the CAR T cells itself, but it needs to be really designed from the beginning. So all the factors need to be there. Also, because of the number of the runs of this clinical trial or the product and batches, because it's a personalized, it's produced per patient. So we have limited number of the product to establish a stability studies. So that's something we always work on it. That's really against our wills when we try to review the stability program because there's no much of data. Another things about the transportation and storage is that you are working with live cells. So live cells need to have special tensions and special requirement, and this is from the pathways. Again, the most important concept actually for the process development, because when you do the clinical trials, you're also doing process development in terms of characterizations. Maybe your process is not going to be changed, the scale is not going to changing, but you need to have some kind of support to the product and to move from clinical trials to the commercial part. And one important aspect is the critical quality attributes. So most of the clinical trials of the CAR T cells, or they share the same critical quality attributes, but there's some also slight differences. So these need to have some tests. Again, GMP is a crucial factor, and the requirement for GMP, that's really important. We have published guidelines for GMP, and we also can provide some consultations from regulatory perspective. One more things about the unique things about CAR T cells actually is what can be released and what can be not released. And this is not common with any medicines. Usually there is a release specification. If it passes, they will be released. If not, the batch will be disposed. But again, this is really depend. Usually part of the file is to do a specification, auto-specification decision tree. And part of it is to show if you have these certain of auto-specification and certain parameters, then it's not releasable. And this is the agreement. And if it can be other part of the parameters, like for example, low viability, this will be depend on the medical director. And this will depend on case by case and the scenario related to it. And just to give you general information, I think with a commercial product, usually 30 to 40% are out of specifications. So, but this is again a part of the CAR T cells. Another general consideration from a quality perspective that we consider a viral vector is part of the active substance and it's not material. That means you have the company or the applicant need to provide the full supportive information. And this is from experience. Another things about the challenges is to have the risk-based approach. So as we said, it's always the evidence, the justifications that always comes from the science, but it's really limited. So it's always good to have this empirical data that can support you when you move from one CAR T cells to another part of CAR T cells, as if they share the same platforms. Again, assessment for the technology and bridging study is really important. And this is really when we try to emphasize that with experience, you can gain and bridge some studies from the first product to another product if you design it well. And this is from our experience. Another important topics that we always see is the potency test and the validations for the potency test. It's very complicated, but also this is something you need to, as an applicant, to pay attention to this because really this will reflect on the studies and the document that you provided. Again, the manufacturing process consistency, that will be related that, and process validations. So you cannot do a process validation for 3 batches only. This is part of the registration, but there is a need to have a verification steps that you can include all the product within time, even the bad one or the failure one, which will have a trend analysis, and that will ensure with the future and allow you with the future that you have consistent procedures. Industrializing procedure in academian process, for example, not everything's happened and works in the research perspective can go to industrialize. There is a transition period or transition phase, early communication with the regulatory that will help with this to standardize it. But again, it's a promising, they have high potential. This is, just want to emphasize that we, within Saudi FDA, actually, we started a project and team specifically for ATMPs. And they've been trained, and we have some internal committee and also outsider international committees that led for CAR T cells specifically and also for ATMPs. And this team now is translated after 3-4 years to a whole department that dedicated everything's related to ATMPs and part. So we also been part of the ICH. We have members that been participating in ICH and the group committee to write the guidelines. And again, Why I'm showing here the roadmap with that, we are following the international practice guidelines. So this, with the FDA and EMA and also the MHRA, we have our own guidelines, but the point here is that these guidelines, they share the same science, same regulations. So we are following the international, so to have more accessible to our local patient, to our local hospitals or the local companies, when they follow our regulation, that they can be outside also. Again, these three important guidelines, all of them published, and you can visit them, and we expect more guidelines to be part of this and to explain it more. Just to finalize, here is some of the learning lessons and remarks. Again, ATMBs is very complex topics. We are working on it within Saudi FDA as a risk-based assessment. We cannot compare it with other products, but just to make it sure that these products are safe and more to the patient. Again, the most important concept that there is a new regulations, a new concept for everybody, for industrial, for also a hospital applicant, and also for regulation worldwide. Therefore, more and proactive and early engagement with the regulator will help a lot to have right regulations. Thank you so much. Yeah.